Okay, so in this second lecture, we are going to talk about some of the important folks in anthropological thinking. There are certainly more people than I can fit into this lecture, but I have it labeled heroes and villains because some of these people did some things that were wonderful, and some of these people did some things that weren't so great. And some people lie somewhere in between, doing some things that furthered the goals of the modern field, and some people who did things that didn't in the end. Um, so we'll talk about each of these people in turn and kind of what they contributed and if they had some literal skeletons in their closet. Okay, before we move too much further into the class, though, I want to stop and define two really important terms. These terms kind of came out of a culmination of the work of all of these early anthropologists. The first term I want to define is cultural relativism, the concept that no one culture is better than another and all cultures should be evaluated or compared on their own terms. Largely, this is the goal of the class, right? You even though you're probably not an anthropology major, take a class in cultural anthropology in an effort to learn to use and possess a culturally relativistic perspective. I want you to leave this course better equipped to not judge other cultures, see their strengths, and evaluate why they do the things they do in a manner that is not ethnocentric. The opposite of that, then, the antithesis of the goal of this class, is an ethnocentric perspective or ethnocentrism. That is the belief that your culture is superior to all other cultures and other things that people do are weird or wrong or stupid or nonsensical. Sometimes this can be okay. Patriotism is, in fact, a kind of minor but good form of ethnocentrism. You can be proud to be from the United States. You can talk about the wonderful things we've done. But at the same time, when you talk about the wonderful things the United States has done at the expense of other cultures, that's when it bleeds over into ethnocentrism. It is no way in it acceptable. So like I mentioned, these two terms are really important. You will find them in the predicted outcomes or expected outcomes for the course. You will see something like to build a culturally relativistic perspective is one of the goals of you taking this course. So it's important to define these two terms really early on. Two other theoretical terms that are really important to this lecture are Imemic and Edik. Imemic is knowledge gained from within a culture, the insider's perspective, and an Edik perspective is the outsider's perspective. Now, you've probably heard similar terms in other science classes you've taken, such as biased and unbiased, objective and subjective. These are definitely related. Inherently, the Imemic or insider's perspective is probably more biased than the outsider's perspective, but at times the outsider or Edik perspective, if it's ethnocentric, can be just as biased as the insider's perspective. In most versions of science, we like to have an objective viewpoint, right? An unbiased viewpoint. And hard sciences are somewhat privileged in their ability to produce results that have that unbiased, though not always, objective perspective. I can't take two different societies of people, put them under a fume hood in isolation and see how they react to each other. A, that would be really unethical, and B, I wouldn't need a fume hood for people, but whatever, you get the point. I can't set up an objective experiment with people and watch and see what happens. So I'm always bringing my own bias into any culture I observe, even if I try to get this Imemic perspective. It's been a big debate in anthropology as to which we should rely on, the objective, the subjective, the Imemic, the Edik, the biased or unbiased. Can we even produce a perspective that is actually unbiased? And the graphic in the bottom shows what, in my opinion, is the case for studying social science, that it's really the Edik and Imemic insider and outsider perspective, and reality lies somewhere in between the two. So anthropologists, I think, are unique in that many of us try to get the insider's perspective. We try to evaluate a culture, being as well as we can a member of that culture, but it's also a weakness in that sometimes you need more of an objective outsider's opinion to really get to reality. So Herodotus is the first person I'm going to talk about, and honestly, other than the fact that he bothered to write about other people, he didn't do that much. There's a little tiny armchair in the corner that suggests that to me they are an armchair anthropologist. I'll explain what I mean by that here in a second, but essentially it means they didn't do any field work. Herodotus coined the term history. It was originally used to describe a method of inquiry in which questions were posed and then answered. He lived around the 5th century BC, so about 2,500 years ago, and he studied the recent past, but his methods of data recovery were somewhat suspect in that he didn't really go out and do any studies. What he did is he asked people who had been places what they had seen, and he talked to people about the recent past, and then he wrote it down. The only reason he makes it here is that he bothered to write about people other than the Greeks. In many ways, the Greeks were, in their mind, the center of the world, and they were very ethnocentric in that way. And he wrote these kind of racist, untrue, and likely insulting accounts of the people, but he bothered to do it, right? So he's kind of a villain who happened to do the right thing. Some of the quotes from Herodotus are funny. You can actually look them up online if you want, and you can see everything he ever wrote. It's all free and out there. He said, however, I shall proceed to mention all that I have learnt of these parts by the most exact inquiries which I've been able to make concerning them. Let me translate that to you. I haven't gone to any of these places. I haven't seen any of these places or talked to any of these people, but I have talked to people that have been there, and I'm going to tell you what they said. That's essentially what he's saying, and it's a very biased way to gather your information. But he bothered to do it. Here's an example of the kind of descriptions of other people that he wrote. Passing over a great extent of this rough country, you come to a people dwelling at the foot of lofty mountains, who are said to be all, both men and women, bald from birth. Well, that's not true. To have flat noses, that's pretty insulting, and very long chins. Hey, that's not nice at all. These people speak a language of their own. Most people do. The dress which they wear is similar to the Scythian, right? So he's just saying, hey, they're kind of like these people. They're kind of ugly. They got long chins. It's not at all culturally relativistic, and is very, very, very ethnocentric. But again, being a Greek, he bothered to write down things about other people. And so it really started, for a while at least, this curiosity of those around us. Hey, maybe there is something of value to not being Greek. Again, kind of a villain who did kind of the right thing. This final Herodotus quote is more of an example of the kind of things he wrote and the way he wrote history. Now, when the tidings of the battle that had been fought at Marathon reached the ears of King Darius, the son of Hephaestus, his anger against the Athenians, which had already been roused by their attack on Sardis, waxed still fiercer, and he became more than ever eager to lead an army against Greece. So you definitely see and hopefully notice that he's writing history books, a little differently than we write history. This is definitely a biased and opinion, and it kind of shows some personality, right? He's saying that this guy was angry and he's going to do this because he's angry. And we don't really write history like that. We wouldn't write, and Abraham Lincoln, before giving the Emancipation Proclamation or the Gettysburg Address, had a bagel sandwich, and we're not going to write history that way. We're going to tell you the important objective facts as we see them. And so it's just kind of different the way Herodotus wrote history. He was trying to entertain people. He was kind of getting in people's heads, talking about emotions that he couldn't have witnessed and things like that. So it's kind of interesting how the writing of history and the writing of science has changed. So as I mentioned previously, I consider Herodotus and many of the people in this lecture to be armchair anthropologists. Mostly these are early anthropologists who did not do field work, right? And as you might remember from the first lecture, I said that anthropologists study somebody somewhere, right? In other words, we go see them, or at least go find them or whatever. So an armchair anthropologist is one that doesn't go out and do field work. And in the modern science of anthropology, calling somebody an armchair anthropologist is kind of an insult, though in my opinion, they still exist. So some people would rather sit in their office, comfy at a university, writing theory and reading other people's reports than going out and actually doing field work. But I think most anthropologists would say that they would rather be out doing field work than sitting in their office. So like I mentioned, banding this about calling anthropologists that armchair anthropologists is probably not the best idea. But essentially most anthropologists, modern anthropologists, value field work, would rather be in the field usually instead of what they're doing, whatever they're doing. And so calling somebody an armchair anthropologist is an insult. But many of the early anthropologists were kind of sitting in their office reading reports or going to bars and listening to people or whatever they were doing to gather their information. Now, strictly speaking, Charles Darwin is not an anthropologist, but I'd be remiss, in my opinion, to talk about the theory of science without mentioning him, any science. Um, and mostly because early on, a lot of people were heavily influenced by theories of evolution, natural selection. And so they tried to apply it to human people. Darwin himself even tried to apply it to human people. And so anthropology has kind of had an on again, off again uh, love affair with evolutionary theory, sometimes to really wrong ends, and often in more modern sense, I think we're actually making progress using it. So basically, we have to talk about Darwin to talk about science at all, because despite the fact that he came up with the theory of natural selection, which is obviously more pertinent to biology, in effect, he changed the method of scientific inquiry. So in 1859, he published On the Origin of Species, quite a while after his voyage on the HMS Beagle. So he did do field work. Note the absence of a armchair in the bottom left corner. Now, a lot of people think that Darwin published directly after his voyage, but he was actually greatly conflicted about publishing his theories. He was worried about what the church would think about what he intended to write, his theory of natural selection, and he was concerned because he would refute or at least argue with the age of the earth. His theories of natural selection and evolutionary gradualism meant that these creatures, it would take a long time for these creatures to develop and change and adapt. And so he struggled with what to do with that, and he didn't publish it for a long time until a young man named Wallace essentially had come up with the same idea. Luckily for Darwin, Wallace sent his paper to one of Darwin's colleagues, and then his colleague said, "Hey, this kid's got the same idea you do. You either publish it now, or we're going to hear about Wallace's theory of natural selection instead of Darwin's." And so Darwin finally published it. Additionally, Darwin went on the HMS Beagle kind of as a gentleman passenger. So a lot of these long survey voyages, the captain would often invite a guest, a gentleman guest, to go with him. Essentially, they were there to keep the captain occupied, to give the captain somebody to talk to. Sometimes they would serve as the ship's doctor. Sometimes they would serve as the ship's naturalist, as Darwin did. And essentially, their job was to keep the captain sane, because often the captain was the only educated person aboard. There may have been midshipmen who were also educated, but those were kids and the captain was in charge of them. And so a lot of times, these long voyages, you would have this guest of the captain who, again, may serve as the doctor, often served as the naturalist. But really, Darwin was just there to keep the captain company. And so in doing that, he had quite a bit of free time when they landed to collect samples and things like that. And so he did. Darwin outlined the process of natural selection. A lot of times people will say that Darwin came up with evolution, and that's kind of true, but kind of not. Lamarck and others already had a concept of evolution, and evolution just simply means change over time. What Darwin outlined was the theory of natural selection, which is the creature best adapted to its current environment is more reproductively successful than one that is not. This would heavily influence anthropologists and archaeologists much later. We will talk about him again, but simply know that he existed, he did field work, he published on natural selection, and was conflicted about whether to publish it or not. So here's a clear villain. Herbert Spencer is one of my least favorite theorists, and maybe one of my least favorite people. He coined the term survival of the fittest, not Darwin. That's often misquoted. Darwin probably would have agreed with that quote. He outlined fitness as adaptation to the current environment, but Spencer made this quote, made this statement, and then kind of twisted it to his own purpose. So for Spencer, survival of the fittest meant survival of the best. And that's not what Darwin said. Darwin said the creature best adapted to its current environment will be more reproductively successful. So if the environment changes, the creature that is best adapted may change as well. Spencer tried to apply the theory of natural selection to people, right? His social theory that he came up with is that society is like a stick figure. And you have the legs, who are the farmers who do all the farming and provide all the food, and you have the hands that are like the blacksmiths, the merchants, and then you have the head, who are the nobles. In his theory, the nobles were inherently better suited to rule over arms and legs, and they were just better at it. And arms should never become heads, because heads are inherently better than arms, and legs are the worst. They're just farmers out there farming, so peasants are not even worth talking about. So he didn't envision a society in which there was social mobility. And not only that, but he figured if you were a criminal, maybe we should just get rid of you and not allow you to reproduce. This is the beginning of what was known as the eugenics movement, which was the beginning of Nazism. The eugenics movement started mostly here in the United States. It was people who believed that some people were inherently superior to other people and that other people, such as criminals, shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. It's a very dangerous set of ideas, and it began with this Herbert Spencer. So he is clearly a villain, clearly misread concepts of natural selection, twisted it towards people, and misused evolution and biological theory and social theory in a very, very bad way. Now, Lewis Henry Morgan was definitely ethnocentric, but what he came up with was useful, or at least the method of doing it. Morgan was fascinated by the Iroquois, the indigenous people of New York, and he actually would run around the woods with his colleagues acting like they were Iroquois. But what he did, he's an armchair anthropologist, he took all the data he could find on various peoples from across the planet, and he came up with this unilineal scheme, meaning that one line, unilineal, evolutionary, change over time, and he thought that societies and cultures moved through a series of steps, right? And he required that each culture possess the ability to make a certain technology before passing from one stage to the next. So I want you to think about whether this is Emic or Edik.